He wasn't supposed to move, not after lying in the snow that long, but something about the way the dog held his breath made the silence feel wrong. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Somewhere warm, I hope. Because on nights like this, warmth isn't a comfort. It's the difference between staying and disappearing. The garden lay still beneath a thin, brittle sheet of frost, the kind that formed quietly after midnight and clung to every blade of grass like a final whisper. The air carried that sharp metallic chill you only feel in the English countryside when winter settles in without warning, and even the hedgerows seemed to shrink from it, their branches stiff, unmoving, as if holding their breath against the cold. Oliver Hayes noticed the quiet first. Not the peaceful kind, not the soft hush of a sleeping village, but the kind that pressed against your ears, heavy and expectant, like something waiting to be found. His boots crunched softly against the gravel path as he stepped through the side gate, the iron latch giving a faint, reluctant click behind him, and for a moment he paused, scanning the small stretch of garden that had once felt like refuge but now seemed unfamiliar, altered by the frost and the absence of sound. "Rex," he called, his voice low, instinctively gentle, the way one speaks to something loyal, something that always answers. But there was no movement, no thump of a tail, no eager sprint across the lawn, just the wind, faint and distant, threading its way through the bare branches. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath cloud in front of him, and took a few more steps forward, the cold biting through the seams of his coat, sharper than he remembered. It wasn't until he reached the center of the garden that he saw him. At first, it didn't even look like a dog, just a shape, half buried in the pale dusting of snow, still and unnatural, as though it had always been there. Rex lay on his side, body curved slightly inward, his thick coat rimmed with frost, each strand of fur tipped with white, catching what little light filtered through the clouded sky. Oliver's chest tightened, not with panic, not yet, but with something heavier, something slower, like a thought he didn't want to finish. No, the word left him under his breath as he moved closer, each step measured, reluctant, as if approaching too quickly might make it real. Rex didn't stir. His eyes were open, dark and glassy, fixed on nothing, and for a heartbeat, just one, Oliver believed what the silence was telling him, that he had come home too late. He crouched beside the dog, his gloved hand hovering just above the thick fur, uncertain, unwilling to touch what might already be gone. The cold here felt different, not just in the air, but in the ground itself, seeping upward, settling into his bones. "You daft thing," he murmured, though there was no irritation in it, only a quiet disbelief, a fragile attempt to make sense of something that didn't. His hand finally lowered, brushing lightly against Rex's side. The fur was stiff with frost, colder than it should have been, and yet, there. A pause. A flicker, so faint he almost missed it. Oliver froze. His breath caught, suspended in the space between what he thought he knew and what his body was beginning to understand. Rex's ear twitched. Just once. Small. Barely there. But enough to fracture the certainty. Rex. This time, the name came sharper, edged with something rising beneath the surface. The dog's chest didn't rise the way it should have. Not visibly. Not enough to reassure. And yet the stillness no longer felt final. It felt deliberate, as if the dog had chosen it. Oliver leaned closer, his eyes narrowing, searching for any sign that would explain what he was seeing, what he wasn't seeing. "Come on, lad," he whispered, his voice softer now, coaxing, almost pleading. "Get up. Inside, it's warmer." He slipped one hand beneath Rex's shoulder, careful, testing, and for a moment the dog allowed it, his body shifting slightly, weight giving just enough to suggest life. But then, with a slow, stubborn insistence, Rex settled back into the exact same position, pressing himself deeper into the snow. Oliver stilled, confusion knitting into something tighter, something uneasy. "What are you doing?" There was no fear in his voice yet. Not fully, just a growing sense that something didn't add up. Rex's eyes, though dimmed by the cold, shifted, just slightly, toward him, and in that brief, fleeting movement, there was recognition. Not panic, not pain, but intent. The kind of look a dog gives when it knows something you don't. Oliver swallowed, the chill in the air suddenly sharper, more intrusive, as if the night itself had leaned closer. He glanced around the garden, taking in the frost-covered ground, the undisturbed edges of snow, the faint impressions near Rex's body that he hadn't noticed before, marks that didn't look like wandering or rest, but repetition. The same place, over and over. He looked back at the dog, who remained where he was, breathing so faintly it was almost impossible to see, yet refusing, utterly refusing, to move. And for the first time since stepping through the gate, Oliver felt it. Not just concern, not just confusion, but a quiet, creeping certainty that Rex wasn't lying in the snow because he couldn't leave. He was lying there because he wouldn't. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth beneath the frost, and Oliver felt it settle into his chest like a quiet warning he could not quite name. Rex did not look at him again, not fully, but there was a tension in the dog's body now, subtle yet unmistakable, as though every ounce of strength he had left was being used not to move, but to remain exactly where he was. Oliver exhaled slowly, his breath unsteady this time, and glanced once more at the ground around them. The snow was thin, barely an inch deep in most places, but here, directly beneath and around Rex, it had been disturbed. Not scattered randomly, not the careless marks of a dog pacing or settling, but shallow grooves, layered, overlapping, as if something had pressed and shifted again and again in the same confined space. He reached out, brushing a gloved hand across the surface just beside Rex's flank. The snow there was compacted, firmer than the rest, resisting his touch slightly, and beneath it, the ground did not feel quite right. Too even, too held together. "What have you done, lad?" he murmured, though his voice carried no accusation, only a growing unease. Rex's ear twitched again, weaker this time, and a faint sound escaped him, not quite a whine, not quite a breath, but something in between, fragile and deliberate. Oliver leaned closer instinctively. "All right," he said under his breath, more to himself than to the dog, as if speaking aloud might steady the thoughts beginning to spiral. "All right, I see you." He shifted his weight, kneeling fully now despite the cold seeping through his trousers, and pressed his hand more firmly into the snow beside Rex. This time, he pushed past the surface layer, fingers digging carefully into the frozen crust. The ground resisted at first, stiff with the night's frost, but then gave slightly, breaking apart in small, brittle fragments. He paused, listening. The garden remained silent, save for the distant whisper of wind brushing against the hedges. But there was something else now, something almost imperceptible, like a faint difference in the way the air settled near the ground. He could not name it. Not yet. But it was enough to keep him there. Oliver drew his hand back, flexing his fingers against the cold, and glanced at Rex again. The dog had not moved, not beyond those small, stubborn flickers of life. Yet there was a steadiness in his gaze now, faint but present, as though he were watching, waiting. Not for help, not for comfort, but for understanding. "You are not staying out here for nothing," Oliver said quietly, the words forming with a certainty he had not felt moments before. "That is not you." He had known Rex long enough to trust what others might dismiss. The dog was not reckless, not careless, and certainly not one to choose discomfort without reason. If he remained here, in the cold, refusing warmth, refusing safety, then there was a reason, and that reason was here. Oliver shifted again, this time moving slightly around Rex's body, careful not to disturb him more than necessary. As he changed angle, the faint impressions in the snow became clearer. Not random at all. A pattern. A boundary. Rex had not been pacing. He had been circling, repeatedly, always returning to the same central point. Oliver's jaw tightened, a quiet tension settling in his expression as the pieces began to align in ways he could not yet fully accept. He brushed more snow aside, working slowly now, methodically, as though any sudden movement might disrupt something delicate beneath. The frost cracked softly under his touch, small pieces breaking away to reveal darker soil beneath, damp and cold. He paused again, leaning closer, his ear tilting instinctively toward the ground, though he did not yet know why he did so. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, faintly, so faintly he almost convinced himself it was imagination, a softness in the stillness. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of complete silence. Oliver froze, his breath held without realizing, his senses straining toward that fragile shift in the air. He looked at Rex. The dog's eyes met his again, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was insistence. Stay, Oliver whispered instinctively, though Rex had not attempted to move. The word felt less like a command and more like a shared understanding. He turned back to the ground, his movements now more deliberate, more careful, as he began to clear a slightly wider space beside where Rex lay. Each handful of snow he removed revealed more of that compacted layer beneath, and with it, a growing sense that whatever lay below had been there long enough to alter the surface, but not long enough to be lost. The soil was cold, but not fully hardened, as though something beneath it had kept it from freezing solid. That thought alone sent a quiet, unwelcome chill through him, one that had nothing to do with the weather. Oliver swallowed, his throat dry, and continued, brushing away frost and loose earth with steady, controlled movements. He did not rush. Could not. Something in him understood that whatever he was uncovering required patience, not force. Rex shifted again, barely, his body tensing for a fraction of a second before settling once more into the same position, as though even that small movement had cost him. Oliver glanced at him quickly. "I am here," he said softly, the words instinctive, grounding. "I am not going anywhere." The dog's breathing remained. Shallow, almost imperceptible, but the tension eased slightly, enough for Oliver to return his focus to the ground. Another layer gave way beneath his fingers, and this time the texture changed. Not soil. Not quite. Something smoother. Oliver stilled, his hand hovering just above it, his pulse quickening in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. He brushed the remaining frost aside, slower now, almost hesitant, as though the truth beneath might vanish if approached too quickly. The surface beneath was pale against the dark earth, partially obscured, and for a brief, disorienting moment, Oliver could not place what he was seeing. It did not belong. Not here. Not beneath his garden. He drew a breath, steadying himself, and leaned closer, his hand moving with careful precision as he cleared the last thin layer covering it. Rex did not move. He simply watched. And in that silent, frozen space, with the cold pressing in from all sides and the ground slowly yielding its secret, Oliver felt the world narrow to a single point beneath his hand, a truth waiting just below the surface, held there by a dog who had refused to leave. For a moment, Oliver could not make sense of what lay beneath his hand, his mind searching for something ordinary to explain the shape emerging from the frost, something harmless, something that belonged to the quiet familiarity of his garden. But the longer he looked, the more that fragile illusion slipped away, replaced by a slow, tightening awareness that this was neither random nor natural, and certainly not something Rex would have chosen to guard without reason. He brushed away the last thin layer of frozen earth, his fingers moving with a careful precision that bordered on reverence, as though whatever he uncovered demanded gentleness, not force. The pale surface beneath resolved itself gradually, its contours becoming clearer with each movement, and then it struck him, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet, undeniable truth that settled into his chest and refused to be ignored. It was not a stone, not a root, not anything that belonged beneath the soil. It was human. Oliver drew in a sharp breath, the cold air catching in his throat as his hand stilled completely. For a second, he did nothing, unable to move forward, unable to retreat, suspended in that fragile space between disbelief and understanding. No, the word escaped him again, softer this time, almost lost to the stillness around them. He forced himself to look closer, his eyes narrowing as he cleared a little more of the frost from the surface. The shape was unmistakable now, a small hand, partially curled, the skin pale against the dark earth, as though it had been hidden there, waiting, held just beneath the surface by the cold. Oliver's pulse quickened, a steady rhythm building in his chest as the weight of the moment pressed in. He glanced at Rex instinctively. The dog had not moved, not beyond the faint rise and fall that marked his shallow breathing, but his gaze remained fixed, unwavering, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Not for rescue, not for relief, but for Oliver to see. "You stayed," Oliver whispered, the words barely audible, carrying a depth of understanding that had not been there before. "You stayed for this." He turned back to the ground, the hesitation gone now, replaced by a controlled urgency that sharpened his movements without making them reckless. He cleared more of the surrounding soil, widening the space carefully, mindful not to disturb what lay beneath more than necessary. The earth gave way slowly, revealing more than just the hand, a small forearm, partially shielded by the compacted layer Rex had kept in place. The soil there was warmer than it should have been, faintly damp, as though something beneath had held on to a trace of life against the cold that surrounded it. Oliver leaned closer again, his breath shallow now, his senses narrowed entirely to the fragile presence beneath the ground. He listened. At first, there was nothing, just the wind, distant and indifferent. But then, faintly, so faintly he almost missed it, there it was again. Not a sound, not in the way he expected, but a softness in the air, a subtle shift, like a breath that had not yet given up. Oliver's heart tightened. "All right," he said quietly, his voice steadier than he felt. "All right, I have got you." He reached forward, his movements deliberate and careful as he cleared the remaining soil from around the small form. The shape beneath resolved itself slowly, piece by piece, until it was no longer something abstract, no longer something uncertain, but a child, curled slightly beneath the surface, shielded from the worst of the cold by the very ground that had concealed them. Oliver's hands trembled slightly as he worked, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he was uncovering. He did not rush, could not. Every movement mattered now. He brushed away the last of the earth from the child's shoulder, then their chest, watching closely for any sign, any indication that the faint impression of life he thought he sensed was real. "Stay with me," he murmured, though he did not know if the words would be heard, or even understood. It did not matter. The act of saying them grounded him, anchored him to the moment in a way that kept everything else at bay. Rex shifted again, barely, a soft, strained movement that drew Oliver's attention for just a second. The dog's body trembled faintly, the effort of remaining in place written in every line of him, and yet he did not attempt to rise, did not try to move away, as though leaving that exact spot, even now, was something he could not allow. Oliver met his gaze briefly. "I see it," he said quietly. "I see what you were trying to show me." The understanding settled fully then, clear and undeniable. Rex had not been lying here because he was too weak to move. He had been lying here to hold something in place, to protect it, to keep it from the cold that would have taken it completely. Oliver turned back, his focus sharpening once more as he slid one hand carefully beneath the child's shoulder, testing the weight, the resistance, ensuring that nothing remained caught beneath the frozen earth. The soil released its hold reluctantly, the cold having stiffened everything it touched, but with steady patience, Oliver freed the small form from its shallow resting place. The air seemed to shift as he did, the stillness breaking just slightly, as though the garden itself acknowledged the change. He lifted the child, gently, cradling them close, instinctively shielding them from the wind, his coat offering what little warmth it could. The faint rise and fall against his chest confirmed what he had barely dared to believe. There was still time. Behind him, Rex remained where he had been, his body finally easing, just a fraction, as though the task he had held on to so fiercely had been passed on at last. Oliver did not look back immediately. He did not need to. He already understood. Some things did not need to be spoken, and some acts did not need explanation. They simply were. And in the quiet, frozen space of that small garden, beneath a sky that offered no comfort, Oliver Hayes held on to a life that should have been lost, guided there by a dog who had chosen, without hesitation, to stay. Oliver moved quickly now, not with panic, but with a steady urgency that came from understanding how little time there might be, his arms tightening instinctively around the small, fragile weight he carried as he turned toward the house. The frost crunching sharply beneath his boots with each step, the sound cutting through the silence that had held the garden moments before. The cold pressed harder now, sharper, as though aware that its hold had been broken, and the wind followed him, threading through the hedges, tugging faintly at his coat. But he did not slow, did not look back, not yet. The back door opened with a firm push, the hinges giving a soft groan as he stepped inside, and the sudden shift in temperature wrapped around him, a muted warmth that felt almost unreal against the chill clinging to his clothes and skin. He crossed the kitchen in a few strides, clearing a space on the old wooden table with one hand, moving aside a stack of papers without looking, his focus entirely on the child in his arms. "Stay with me," he murmured again, the words quieter now, almost a rhythm, something to anchor both of them in the moment as he laid the small form gently onto the table, his coat still wrapped loosely around them to preserve what little warmth remained. The light above flickered once before settling, casting a soft glow that revealed more clearly what the cold and darkness had concealed. The child's face was pale, still, framed by damp strands of hair, their features softened by the quiet stillness of exhaustion rather than harm, and that alone steadied something in Oliver's chest, a fragile reassurance that he had not arrived too late. He moved quickly but carefully, his hands steady despite the cold that had numbed his fingers, adjusting the coat, ensuring it remained around the child while he reached for a thick wool blanket draped over the back of a nearby chair. He wrapped it gently, layering warmth rather than forcing it, instinct guiding his movements in a way that felt both immediate and practiced, drawn from a place deeper than thought. For a brief moment, he paused, watching closely, searching for the faint rise and fall he had felt before, and there it was again, subtle but present, a quiet persistence that refused to fade. "That is it," he said softly, almost to himself, a breath of relief threading through the tension in his voice. He turned then, reaching for the kettle, his movements efficient, measured, the familiar routine grounding him further as he filled it and set it on the hob, the small click of the switch echoing faintly in the stillness of the kitchen. The ordinary sound felt out of place against the weight of what had just unfolded, yet somehow necessary, a reminder that not everything had shifted, not everything had been altered. As the kettle began its slow rise toward a boil, Oliver returned to the table, adjusting the blanket once more, his hand hovering briefly over the child's shoulder before resting there lightly, offering warmth without pressure, presence without urgency. "You are not alone," he murmured, the words simple, unadorned, yet carrying a quiet certainty that did not need explanation. Outside, beyond the closed door, the garden remained as it had been, still and cold, but something had changed there too, something subtle, as though the silence had lost its hold, its weight less absolute now that the truth it had concealed had been uncovered. Oliver's gaze shifted briefly toward the door, and with that glance came the realization he had pushed aside in the urgency of the moment. Rex. The thought struck him not with panic, but with a sharp, quiet clarity. He had left him there. Not forgotten. Never that. But left, trusting, because the dog had made his choice clear. Oliver inhaled slowly, his chest tightening just slightly as he turned back to the child, ensuring once more that the blanket was secure, that the faint rhythm of breath remained steady, however fragile. "I will be right back," he said quietly, though whether the words were meant for the child or for himself, he could not be certain. He moved to the door, pulling on his coat again without hesitation, the residual cold still clinging to the fabric as he stepped back outside, the contrast between the warmth of the kitchen and the biting chill of the night striking him more sharply this time. The air seemed colder now, the wind more insistent, as though the world had shifted subtly in the moments he had been inside. He crossed the garden quickly, his steps purposeful, his eyes already fixed on the place where Rex lay. The dog had not moved far. Not at all, in truth. He remained where Oliver had left him, his body still curved into that familiar shape, though the tension that had once held him there seemed to have eased, replaced by a quiet stillness that felt different, softer somehow. Oliver approached slowly this time, the urgency replaced by something steadier, something deeper. He crouched beside Rex once more, his hand reaching out without hesitation to rest against the dog's side, feeling for the faint rhythm he had sensed before. It was still there, faint, slower now, but present. "You stubborn old thing," Oliver murmured, a quiet warmth threading through the words despite the cold that surrounded them. "You could have come inside." Rex's ear twitched, just slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, and in that moment, the weight of what the dog had done settled fully, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet truth that needed no explanation. He had stayed because something needed him to stay, because leaving had never been an option. Oliver exhaled slowly, his hand moving gently through the frost-tipped fur, careful not to disturb more than necessary. "It is all right," he said, softly, his voice steady, certain. "I have got them now." The words were not a command, not even reassurance. They were a promise. And for the first time since Oliver had stepped into the garden, Rex allowed his body to relax completely, the last thread of resistance easing away as though the task he had carried had finally been set down. The cold did not feel as sharp now, though it still clung to the air, threading through the garden with a quiet persistence that refused to fully release its hold. But Oliver barely noticed it anymore, not in the way he had before, because his attention had narrowed once again to the dog beside him, to the faint rhythm beneath his hand that had become the only thing that mattered in that moment. Rex's breathing was still there, fragile and uneven, each rise and fall so slight it could have been missed by anyone not searching for it. But Oliver felt it, steadying himself with it, anchoring his focus in that small, stubborn sign of life. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low, calm, the same tone he had used countless times before, though never quite like this, never with this weight behind it. "You have done enough." The words seemed to settle into the space between them, not as an instruction, but as a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of something that did not need to be explained. Rex did not respond immediately, his body still, the tension that had held him for so long now completely gone, replaced by a softness that spoke of exhaustion rather than resistance. Oliver slid his hand gently beneath the dog's shoulder, testing the weight. Careful, always careful, mindful of how little strength might remain. This time, there was no refusal, no subtle shift back into place, no insistence on staying exactly where he had been. Rex allowed it. That alone told Oliver everything he needed to know. "That is it," he said quietly, almost a breath. "Come on, lad." He lifted him slowly, drawing the dog close against his chest, the familiar weight both grounding and fragile at once. The thick coat still cold to the touch, though beneath it there remained a trace of warmth, faint but present, held on to with the same quiet determination that had brought Oliver to this moment. The journey back to the house felt shorter, though the distance had not changed, each step measured and steady as Oliver crossed the frost-hardened ground, the garden now nothing more than a shadow behind him, its secret uncovered, its silence broken. The door opened again with that same soft groan, and the warmth inside greeted them once more, gentler this time, as though aware of the weight being carried within it. Oliver moved quickly but without haste, crossing to the sitting room where the fire had long since burned low to embers, their faint glow casting a soft, flickering light across the space. He knelt by the hearth, lowering Rex carefully onto the thick rug, positioning him near the warmth but not too close, instinct guiding the balance between comfort and caution. "Stay with me," he said softly, though the words were no longer a request, but a quiet reassurance, a promise that the dog was no longer alone in whatever battle he had been fighting in silence. Rex's eyes opened slightly, just enough to catch the light, just enough to find Oliver's face, and in that brief moment, there was something there that went beyond recognition, beyond simple awareness. It was peace, not the absence of struggle, but the quiet acceptance that the task had been completed, that what needed to be done had been done. Oliver reached for another blanket, heavier this time, and draped it carefully over the dog's body, his movements deliberate, mindful of every detail, every small adjustment that might offer even the slightest comfort. "You kept him safe," he murmured, the words forming without thought, drawn from a place deeper than reason. "You stayed when anyone else would have left." The fire crackled softly, a low, steady sound that filled the room, replacing the silence that had once dominated the garden, and for a moment, Oliver allowed himself to sit back on his heels, his hand resting gently against Rex's side, feeling that faint, precious rhythm continue beneath his palm. From the kitchen, the quiet click of the kettle switching off broke through, a reminder of the other life now waiting within the house, the child wrapped in warmth, breathing, still here. Oliver closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, drawing in a slow breath, letting the weight of everything settle into something he could carry. Then he stood, moving back toward the kitchen, his steps steady, purposeful, each movement guided by the same quiet resolve that had carried him this far. The child lay where he had left them, wrapped securely, their breathing still faint but steady, a fragile thread holding on against the cold that had nearly taken it. Oliver approached slowly, his gaze softening as he watched that subtle rise and fall, that quiet persistence that mirrored, in its own way, the one he had just left by the fire. "You are all right," he said gently, more certain now, the words carrying a quiet conviction that had not been there before. He reached for a cup, pouring warm water, not too hot, testing it carefully before dipping a cloth and bringing it back to the table, his movements calm, measured, each action deliberate, as though guided by something beyond simple instinct. As he worked, the house seemed to settle around him, the warmth growing, the air softening, the cold that had once pressed in from every side now held at bay by something quieter, something steadier. Outside, the frost would remain until morning, the garden would bear its marks, the disturbed earth, the shallow impressions, the place where a dog had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. But inside, in the quiet glow of the fire and the gentle warmth of the kitchen, something else had taken hold, something that did not need words to be understood. Oliver glanced once more toward the sitting room, toward the place where Rex lay, and though he could not see him from where he stood, he did not need to. He knew, and in that knowing, there was a quiet, unspoken gratitude, one that settled not in words, but in the steady rhythm of breath that now filled the house. Two lives held there, fragile but present, because one had refused to walk away. The house no longer felt like it had before he stepped through the gate that night. Something in its quiet had shifted, not in a way that could be seen or touched, but in the way the air settled, in the way each sound carried a little further, as if the walls themselves had become aware of the fragile lives now held within them. Oliver moved between the kitchen and the sitting room with a steady rhythm, not rushed, not hesitant, simply present in each step, his attention divided yet entirely focused, as though every movement mattered, every second held weight. The child's breathing had grown slightly stronger, still faint, but no longer as uncertain as it had been moments ago, each rise of the chest more defined, more willing to continue, and Oliver found himself watching it again and again, drawn to that quiet persistence like a man listening for something sacred in the stillness. "That is it," he murmured softly, adjusting the blanket once more, ensuring the warmth held close without pressing too much, his hands careful, always careful, as though guided by something deeper than thought. He reached for the telephone on the wall, pausing for just a second before lifting the receiver, the familiar weight of it grounding him in the reality of what needed to be done next. His fingers moved with practiced precision as he dialed, each number deliberate, the soft clicks echoing faintly in the quiet kitchen. When the line connected, his voice remained calm, steady, though beneath it there was an urgency that did not need to be spoken aloud. He explained what he had found, not in dramatic detail, but in simple, clear terms, enough for the person on the other end to understand that this was not a call that could wait. As he listened to the response, he nodded once, though no one could see it, and set the receiver back gently into place. "They are on their way," he said quietly, turning his gaze back to the child, the words offered as reassurance, even if they could not yet be understood. He remained there for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly against the blanket, feeling the subtle warmth beginning to return, the cold retreating inch by inch, and with it, the tension that had gripped him since stepping into the garden began to ease, not disappearing, but settling into something he could carry. Then, without hesitation, he moved back toward the sitting room, drawn by the quiet presence he had left behind. Rex lay where he had been placed, the blanket rising and falling faintly with each breath, the fire casting a soft glow across his coat, melting the frost that had clung to it, leaving the fur damp but warmer now, the sharp edges of the cold softened by the gentle heat. Oliver knelt beside him once more, his hand finding its place against the dog's side, feeling for that same fragile rhythm, and there it was, slower now, but steadier, no longer held in tension, no longer forced against the cold. "You did not make it easy, did you?" he said quietly, a faint trace of something softer in his voice, not quite a smile, but close enough to ease the weight of the moment. Rex's eyes opened again, just slightly, the light catching in them, and for a brief second, there was that same awareness, that same quiet recognition, as if he understood not just the words, but everything that had passed between them without needing to be said. Oliver leaned back slightly, his gaze lingering, taking in the small details he might have missed before, the faint tremor in the dog's limbs, the way his breathing caught and then steadied, the quiet resilience that had carried him through the cold and into this moment. "It is all right now," Oliver murmured, the words softer, more certain. "You can rest." The fire shifted, a small crackle breaking through the stillness, and for a moment, everything seemed to settle into a fragile balance. The warmth, the quiet, the steady presence of two lives holding on. From the distance, faint at first, then growing slightly clearer, came the sound of an approaching engine, tires moving along the narrow road beyond the hedgerow, the low hum threading its way through the night air. Oliver's head lifted slightly, his attention drawn to it, recognizing what it meant without needing to see it. Help was close now. Not abstract, not hoped for, but real, tangible, on its way. He glanced once more at Rex, his hand still resting gently against him. "Hear that?" he said quietly. "You were right to wait." Rex did not move, not beyond the faint rise and fall that marked his breath, but something in his stillness had changed, a quiet release, as though the sound itself carried meaning, not in words, but in the simple fact that it had arrived. Oliver rose slowly, his movements unhurried, and returned to the kitchen once more, checking the child, adjusting the blanket again, ensuring that nothing had shifted, that the fragile warmth remained intact. The sound of the engine grew louder now, closer, accompanied by the faint crunch of tires on frost-hardened ground as it turned into the narrow drive, the headlights casting a soft glow through the window, cutting briefly across the kitchen wall. Oliver moved toward the door, pausing for just a second before opening it, the cold air rushing in once more, though it no longer carried the same weight it had before. Two figures stepped out from the vehicle, their presence calm, purposeful, the quiet efficiency of people who understood the importance of arriving not just quickly, but correctly. Oliver stepped aside, guiding them in without unnecessary words, his gestures clear, his focus unwavering as he led them first to the kitchen, where the child lay, then toward the sitting room, where Rex remained by the fire. As they moved through the house, the stillness shifted again, not broken, but shared now, carried by more than one set of hands, more than one steady breath. Oliver stood back slightly, allowing them space, his gaze moving between the two lives he had carried into the warmth, watching as others took over where he had left off, not replacing what he had done, but continuing it. And in that quiet exchange, with the cold kept at bay and the fragile thread of life held steady within the walls of that small house, there was something else, something unspoken yet undeniable, a sense that what had happened in the garden had not been chance, not accident, but something chosen, something seen by a dog who had understood what needed to be done and had done it without hesitation, without question, simply because it was right. The presence of others did not break the quiet inside the house. It reshaped it, turning what had once been a solitary stillness into something shared, something held between steady voices and careful hands. Oliver stepped back as the paramedics moved with calm precision, their coats carrying the faint scent of cold air and antiseptic, their movements efficient yet gentle as they knelt beside the table, assessing the child with quiet focus, exchanging brief, low words that carried meaning without urgency. One of them glanced up at Oliver, a subtle nod passing between them, not a question, not yet, but an acknowledgement that he had done what needed to be done. "You found them outside?" the man asked softly, his voice measured, professional, yet not detached. Oliver nodded once. "In the garden," he replied, his tone steady, though the memory of it still lingered just beneath the surface. "Under the frost." The paramedic's expression shifted slightly, not in shock, but in understanding, as though he had seen enough of the world to recognize the weight behind those words without needing them to be expanded. "You did well to bring them in," he said quietly, before returning his attention to the task at hand. The second paramedic adjusted the blanket gently, checking the child's breathing, their hands careful, deliberate, never rushed, as though each movement carried its own quiet importance. The air in the kitchen seemed to hold steady, the warmth now settled, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but present in a way that could be relied upon. Oliver remained where he stood, not interfering, not stepping forward, simply watching, his gaze steady, his breathing even, as the situation moved beyond his hands and into theirs. From the sitting room, a faint sound reached him, barely more than a shift in fabric, a subtle change in the rhythm of the house that drew his attention back, gently but firmly. Rex. Oliver turned without hesitation, moving toward the doorway, his steps quiet against the wooden floor, the light from the fire spilling softly into the hall as he crossed the threshold. The dog lay where he had been, though something in his posture had changed, the tightness gone, replaced by a deeper stillness that spoke not of strain, but of release. Oliver knelt beside him again, his hand finding its place against the dog's side, feeling that fragile rhythm that had become so familiar in such a short time. It was still there, faint, slower than before, but steady enough to hold on to. "They are here," Oliver murmured, his voice low, calm, as though the words themselves might carry reassurance. "You can hear them, can you not?" Rex's ear flicked once, the smallest acknowledgement, and though his eyes did not fully open this time, there was a softness in his stillness, a quiet awareness that needed no confirmation. Oliver's hand moved gently through the dog's fur, now warm where the fire had touched it, though traces of dampness remained, reminders of the cold that had once claimed every inch of that coat. "You stayed longer than you should have," Oliver said softly, though there was no reproach in it, only a quiet recognition of the cost. "But you stayed." The words lingered in the air, settling into the space between them, carrying more than their meaning, carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. In the kitchen, the low murmur of voices continued, punctuated by the soft sounds of equipment being prepared, the careful, methodical process of ensuring that the fragile life they had been called to protect would continue to hold. Oliver listened for a moment, his attention divided, yet grounded, aware of both spaces at once, aware that what had begun in silence was now unfolding in motion. Footsteps approached behind him, measured and respectful, and one of the paramedics appeared in the doorway, pausing briefly before stepping fully into the room. "We are taking the child in," he said quietly, his tone steady, informative rather than urgent. "They are stable, but we would like to be cautious." Oliver nodded, the confirmation settling into him with a quiet sense of relief that did not need to be expressed. "Of course," he replied, his voice calm. The man's gaze shifted briefly to Rex, taking in the scene with a quick, practiced look, noting the position, the condition, the quiet resilience that still lingered in the dog's form. "He has been out there as well?" he asked, though the answer was already clear. Oliver glanced down at Rex, his hand still resting against him. "He did not leave," he said simply. The paramedic's expression softened slightly, a brief pause marking the recognition of what that meant, before he nodded once. "We can have someone take a look at him too," he offered. Oliver considered the words for a moment, then shook his head gently. "Let them take the child first," he said quietly. "He will not go anywhere." The man inclined his head in understanding, then stepped back, leaving Oliver once more in the quiet presence of the fire and the dog who had brought him to this point. In the kitchen, movement increased slightly, the careful transition from stillness to action as the child was prepared to be moved, the soft rustle of blankets, the quiet coordination of hands working together with purpose. Oliver remained where he was, his focus returning fully to Rex, to the faint rhythm beneath his palm, to the steady presence that had carried him through the cold and into this moment. "You hear that?" he murmured, his voice softer now, almost reflective. "They are safe." Rex did not move, not beyond the subtle rise and fall that marked his breath, but something in his stillness seemed to ease further, as though the final piece of what he had held onto had now been set down. Oliver exhaled slowly, his hand resting gently against the dog's side, feeling that fragile rhythm continue. And in that quiet, shared moment, with the warmth of the fire holding steady and the distant sounds of careful hands carrying life forward, there was a sense not of ending, but of completion, a task fulfilled, a promise kept without words, written instead in the simple, unwavering act of staying when leaving would have been easier. The moment they lifted the child, the house seemed to hold its breath again, not in fear this time, but in a quiet anticipation, as though every wall, every shadow, every flicker of firelight was aware that something fragile was being carried forward, something that had been pulled back from the edge by nothing more than time, warmth, and the silent decision of a dog who refused to leave. Oliver stood just inside the sitting room doorway, watching as the paramedics moved carefully through the narrow hall, their steps measured, their voices low, the soft rustle of blankets and fabric marking the transition from stillness to motion. The child did not stir much, only the faintest shift as they were lifted, the blanket held close, preserving the warmth that had been fought for, inch by inch, breath by breath. Mind the step, one of the men murmured as they passed through the threshold, his tone calm, steady, as though guiding not just the movement, but the moment itself. Oliver followed them only as far as the door, stopping there, his hand resting lightly against the frame as he watched them cross the garden, the frost still clinging to the ground, the faint marks of what had happened earlier still visible beneath the thin layer of snow, a quiet record of a night that had nearly ended very differently. The vehicle waited with its soft glow of interior light, the doors open, ready, and as they reached it, the child was guided inside with the same careful precision, the same quiet understanding that had carried them through every step. One of the paramedics turned back briefly, meeting Oliver's gaze with a small, reassuring nod. "They are holding on," he said simply. "You did the right thing." Oliver inclined his head once, the words settling into him not as praise, but as confirmation, something steady to hold on to as the door of the vehicle closed and the engine resumed its low hum. The lights shifted, turning slowly, and then the vehicle moved, its tires crunching softly against the frozen ground as it made its way back along the narrow drive and disappeared beyond the hedgerow, the sound fading gradually until the night reclaimed its quiet once more. For a few seconds, Oliver remained where he was, standing in the doorway, the cold air brushing past him, no longer biting, no longer sharp, just present, part of the world that had nearly taken something it could not quite keep. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the dim light, and then turned back inside, closing the door behind him with a soft, deliberate motion. The house welcomed him again, the warmth steady now, settled, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain. The fire in the sitting room burned a little stronger, the embers stirred by the air that had followed him in, casting a gentle glow that filled the space with a quiet sense of calm. Rex lay where he had been left, unchanged in position, yet entirely different in presence. The tension that had once held him rigid in the cold was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt earned, a rest that had come only after something necessary had been completed. Oliver crossed the room slowly, his steps softer now, his movements unhurried, as though the urgency that had driven him before had finally eased its grip. He knelt beside the dog once more, his hand finding its place against the familiar rise and fall of breath, feeling it, measuring it, holding on to it as though it were something fragile and valuable. "They have gone," he said quietly, not as information, but as a gentle reassurance. "They are safe now." Rex's breathing remained slow, shallow but steady, each breath a quiet continuation, each one enough. His eyes did not open this time, but there was a subtle shift in the way his body rested, a deeper settling, as though the final thread of what had kept him alert had been released. Oliver let his hand remain where it was, his fingers moving lightly through the dog's fur, now dry in places, warmed by the fire, though the memory of the cold still lingered in the edges of it. "You knew," he murmured, the words soft, reflective. "You knew before anyone else did." The room seemed to absorb the words, holding them in the same quiet way it had held everything else that night, without judgment, without question. Oliver leaned back slightly, resting on his heels, his gaze steady as he took in the small details, the rise and fall of the blanket, the faint flicker of light across Rex's coat, the quiet rhythm that had become the center of everything. Outside, the wind moved again, brushing softly against the windows, no longer harsh, no longer insistent, just a distant presence, a reminder of the world beyond the walls. Inside, the air felt different now, not just warmer, but fuller, as though something unseen had shifted, something intangible yet undeniable. Oliver drew in a slow breath, letting it out gradually, the weight of the night settling into something quieter, something that did not press as heavily against him anymore. He reached for a folded blanket nearby and adjusted it slightly over Rex, ensuring the warmth held steady, his movements gentle, precise, the same care he had given everything else. "Rest now," he said softly, the words barely more than a whisper. "You have done what needed to be done." The fire crackled quietly in response, a soft, steady sound that filled the room, not breaking the silence, but completing it, adding to it in a way that felt natural, right? Oliver remained there, not moving, not speaking further, simply present, his hand resting against the dog, his attention grounded in that fragile, persistent rhythm. Time passed, though it did not feel like it in the usual sense, the minutes stretching, blending, marked only by the slow, steady continuation of breath and the gentle shifting of light. And in that quiet space, with the cold kept outside and the warmth holding steady within, there was a sense not of what had been avoided, but of what had been chosen, a decision made without words, carried out without hesitation, and now resting, finally, in the stillness that followed. The night did not end all at once. It loosened its grip slowly, like frost retreating from glass, and inside the house that quiet persistence remained, steady and unbroken, held together by warmth, by breath, by the simple act of staying present when there was nothing left to fix. Oliver had not moved far from where he knelt beside Rex, though time had shifted around him, minutes stretching into something softer, less defined, marked only by the gentle crackle of the fire and the slow rhythm beneath his hand that he refused to stop feeling. Outside, the wind had calmed, its voice reduced to a distant murmur brushing lightly against the hedgerows, and with it came a subtle change in the air, the kind that spoke of early morning not yet visible, a faint easing of the cold that had ruled the night. Oliver became aware of it gradually, not through sight, but through the way the room settled, the way the fire no longer had to fight quite as hard to hold its warmth. Rex remained still, his body relaxed. In a way it had not been before, the tension that had once defined every line of him now gone, replaced by something quieter, something deeper. His breathing was still faint, still measured, but there was a steadiness to it now, a rhythm that no longer felt like resistance, but like recovery. Oliver shifted slightly, adjusting his position, his hand never leaving the dog's side, as though that connection itself held meaning beyond comfort. "You are still here," he murmured, the words almost lost to the soft sounds around them. Good. There was no need for more than that. No need to fill the silence with explanation or praise. What had been done did not require it. It simply was. He glanced toward the window, where the faintest hint of gray had begun to replace the deeper black of night, not yet light, but no longer complete darkness. The glass held a thin film of condensation, catching the glow of the fire behind him, reflecting it back in soft, wavering shapes. Beyond it, the garden lay quiet, its earlier disturbance now softened by the settling frost, though the place where the earth had been disturbed remained visible, a subtle indentation, a mark that would not be erased by morning. Oliver's gaze lingered there for a moment, not with unease, but with a quiet recognition of what it represented. A place where something had nearly ended, and did not. He turned back to Rex, his hand moving slightly, fingers brushing gently through the dog's fur, now fully warmed, the last traces of cold having given way to the steady heat of the room. "You chose that spot," he said softly, more to himself than to the dog. "Out of all the ground, you chose that one." The thought did not feel like coincidence. It never had. There had been intention in it. Not in the way humans explained intention, not in logic or reason, but in something deeper, something instinctive, something that did not ask questions, only acted when it mattered. Rex's ear shifted faintly, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but enough to draw Oliver's attention back fully, enough to confirm that the awareness remained, even if it rested now beneath layers of exhaustion. "It is over," Oliver continued, his voice steady, quiet. "There is nothing left for you to hold on to out there." The words settled into the space between them, not as instruction, but as release. And for a moment, nothing changed. Then, slowly, so slowly it could have been missed, Rex's breathing deepened just slightly, the rhythm shifting from something held tight to something allowed, something that no longer needed to fight for each inch of air. Oliver felt it beneath his hand, that subtle change, and something in his chest eased with it, a tension he had not fully acknowledged finally loosening its hold. The fire burned lower now, the embers glowing with a steady, quiet light, their warmth consistent, no longer flickering with the uncertainty of earlier hours. The room felt settled, grounded, as though it had found its balance again. Oliver leaned back a little, resting against the side of the armchair, his hand still in place, unwilling to break that simple connection just yet. Time continued to pass, though it no longer felt urgent, no longer measured in seconds or minutes, but in breaths, in the steady continuation of something that had nearly been lost. Warmth that now filled the room. Outside, the first faint suggestion of morning began to take hold, a subtle shift in the color of the sky, barely noticeable, yet undeniable. The cold would lift soon. The frost would melt. The marks in the garden would soften, fade, but they would not disappear entirely, not in the way that mattered. Oliver remained where he was, his hand still resting against the dog who had refused to leave, his attention steady, grounded in the simple, quiet continuation of breath. And in that stillness, with nothing left to fix, nothing left to find, there was only one thing that remained, something small, something easy to overlook, yet carrying the weight of everything that had happened. He stayed. And because of that, something else did too. Morning did not arrive with brightness, not at first. It came quietly, a gradual lifting of shadow rather than a sudden burst of light, the kind that seeps into a room without asking, softening the edges of everything it touches, and Oliver noticed it not through the window, but in the way the fire's glow no longer dominated the space, in the way the air felt less heavy, less burdened by the cold that had defined the night. He shifted slightly where he sat, his body stiff from remaining in one place for so long, yet he did not move his hand, not yet, keeping it resting gently against Rex's side, still feeling that steady rhythm, still anchoring himself to it, as though it were the only measure that mattered. Rex had not changed much in appearance, not outwardly, his body still, his form relaxed into the blanket. But there was something different in the quality of his breathing, something fuller now, less strained, as though each breath no longer had to be pulled through resistance, but could come and go without effort. Oliver felt it before he fully understood it, that subtle shift, that quiet improvement, and he allowed himself a slow breath in response, something deeper than the ones he had taken. Through the night, something closer to relief. "You are stronger," he murmured, his voice low, steady, the words not meant to wake, not meant to demand, only to acknowledge. The room held that statement. Gently, the silence around it unbroken, supportive, as if even the house understood that this was not a moment for noise, but for quiet recognition. Outside, the faint light continued to grow, turning the sky from deep gray to something softer, something that hinted at pale blue beyond the clouds. And through the window, the garden began to take shape again, no longer just a dark expanse, but a space with detail, with form, with memory. The disturbed patch of earth was clearer now, more defined in the morning light, its edges sharp against the surrounding frost, a mark that told a story without needing to be read aloud. Oliver's gaze drifted there for a moment, his mind tracing the path back to that point, the steps, the hesitation, the realization, but he did not linger long. The past few hours did not feel distant, but they no longer held him in the same way. What mattered now was here, in this room, in this breath. A soft sound broke the quiet, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the shifting of the fire, but then clearer, more deliberate. Oliver's attention returned instantly to Rex, his hand pressing ever so slightly more firmly against the dog's side as he leaned forward just a fraction. Rex's head moved. Not much, not a full lift, just a subtle shift, the kind that might have gone unnoticed if one were not watching so closely. But Oliver was. He had been watching all night. "Easy," he said softly, the word carrying both reassurance and caution. Rex's eyes opened slowly, not fully at first, but enough to let in the light, enough to find Oliver's face where it hovered close. There was no confusion in that gaze, no panic, no searching for understanding. Just recognition. Familiar. Grounded. Present. Oliver felt something settle in his chest at that look, something quiet but undeniable. "There you are," he murmured, a faint warmth threading through his voice now, something lighter than before. "You took your time." Rex blinked once, slow, deliberate, as though even that small act required thought, required energy that was still being gathered, still being restored. His breathing remained steady, deeper now than it had been, though still measured, still careful, as if the body had not yet fully remembered how to move without restraint. Oliver's hand moved gently, brushing along the dog's neck, feeling the warmth there, the life that had held on through the cold and now rested, no longer pushed to its limits. "It is done," Oliver said quietly, his voice carrying a calm certainty that had grown stronger with the light. "You do not need to stay out there anymore." The words were simple, but they carried weight, not as instruction, but as closure, a quiet end to something that had begun without words and now finished the same way. Rex's gaze remained steady, his eyes following Oliver without strain, and then, slowly, he let them close again, not in weakness, but in rest, in trust, in the simple acceptance that what needed to be watched over had been passed on. Oliver remained where he was, his hand still resting against him, feeling the steady rhythm continue, no longer fragile in the same way, no longer uncertain. The fire burned lower now, its warmth still present but no longer central, as the light from outside began to fill the room more fully, soft and even, revealing details that had been hidden through the night. The edges of the furniture, the grain of the wood, the subtle patterns in the rug beneath Rex, all of it coming into view as the house shifted from night into morning. From somewhere beyond the walls, the faint sound of birds began to emerge, tentative at first, as if testing the air, then slightly more confident, small notes carried on the cool morning breeze, threading their way into the quiet space within. Oliver listened to them for a moment, his attention broadening, no longer confined entirely to the immediate, but still grounded in it. He glanced once more toward the window, watching as the frost began to lose its sharpness, its grip loosening under the touch of light, though the marks in the garden remained, visible, unchanged. "They will come back," he said softly, almost to himself, his voice thoughtful now. "They will want to know how it happened." He did not need to explain who they were. It was understood. The people from the night. The ones who had taken the child. The ones who would return with questions, with answers, with the continuation of something that had begun here. Oliver looked down at Rex again, his expression calm, steady. "I am not sure I can tell them properly," he admitted quietly. "Not in a way that makes sense." The fire gave a soft crack in response, as if acknowledging the truth of that. Some things did not fit neatly into explanation. Some things were not meant to be broken down into reason and sequence. They simply were. Rex did not respond, not outwardly, but the steady rhythm beneath Oliver's hand remained, unchanged, constant, a quiet answer in itself. And as the morning settled fully into the room, replacing the last traces of night, there was a sense not of something ending, but of something carried forward, something that would not be forgotten, not because it was spoken, but because it had been lived, fully, quietly, and without hesitation. The morning settled fully now, not as something dramatic, but as a quiet certainty, the kind that does not ask for attention, yet changes everything simply by being present. And within that soft light the house felt different again, no longer a place that had held tension through the night, but one that carried a calm weight, the kind that comes after something has been endured and understood without needing to be explained. Oliver rose slowly from where he had been kneeling, his movements careful, not because he feared disturbing Rex, but because he had learned, over the course of the night, that some moments asked for gentleness even when urgency had passed. He stretched slightly, the stiffness in his shoulders easing as he drew in a deeper breath, the air now warmer, lighter, carrying faint traces of the morning beyond the walls. From the sitting room window, the garden was fully visible now, its details no longer hidden by shadow, and Oliver found himself walking toward it without thinking, his gaze drawn outward, back to the place where everything had shifted. The frost was beginning to melt at the edges, softening the sharp white into something more fluid, more transient, yet the disturbed patch of earth remained clear, its shape defined, its meaning unchanged. He opened the back door slowly, the hinge giving its familiar quiet sound, and stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his face, no longer biting, no longer harsh, just present, part of the morning as much as the light itself. The ground felt different beneath his boots now, less rigid, the frost giving way slightly with each step as he crossed the garden once more, not with urgency this time, but with intention. He stopped at the place where Rex had lain, looking down at the shallow indentation, The marks of where the dog's body had pressed against the earth, where he had stayed through the cold, through the hours, through everything that might have told him to leave. Oliver crouched slowly, his gloved hand brushing lightly across the surface, feeling the dampness beneath the melting frost, the ground softer now, no longer holding its secret, no longer hiding what had been found. "You chose this," he said quietly, his voice carried away slightly by the open air, though there was no one there to hear it, no one but the memory of what had taken place. Not by chance. The words did not feel like speculation. They felt like truth. He remained there for a moment longer, his gaze steady, taking in the small details, the uneven edges, the subtle signs of movement, the quiet evidence of a night that would not be forgotten simply because the light had returned. Then he rose, turning back toward the house, his steps measured, his mind no longer searching for answers, but settling into something quieter, something more accepting. Inside, the warmth greeted him again, wrapping around him in a way that felt familiar now, grounded, and as he closed the door behind him, the outside world seemed to recede slightly, held at a distance by the simple barrier of wood and glass. "Back," he said softly, as though continuing a conversation that had never needed words. "It looks different in the light." Rex's eyes opened again, a little wider this time, the morning light reflecting faintly in them. And there was something clearer there now, not just recognition, but presence, the kind that does not question where it is, but simply exists within it. Oliver allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile, not broad, not outward, but enough to soften the lines of his face. "You will want to stand soon," he murmured, though his tone held no expectation, only a quiet understanding of what would come in time. He reached for a bowl nearby, filling it with fresh water from the kitchen tap, the simple act grounding him further in the present, in the normal rhythm that had been interrupted but not lost. He placed it carefully near Rex, close enough to reach without strain, then settled back again, not forcing, not urging, simply making it available. "When you are ready," he said quietly. The house remained still around them, though not silent in the same way as before. The faint sounds of morning had begun to filter in, distant traffic, birds more confident now in their song, the subtle hum of life continuing beyond the walls. Oliver listened to it all without focusing on any one thing, his attention resting where it had all night, with the dog beside him, with the quiet presence that had guided everything that followed. Time moved forward, gently, without pressure, and in that slow passage, Rex shifted again, a little more this time, his front leg adjusting, his head lifting just slightly before settling again. The movement small but meaningful, a sign not of struggle, but of return. Oliver did not react immediately, did not break the calm with sudden motion or words. He simply watched, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged. "That is enough," he said softly. "You do not need to prove anything." The words carried no weight of expectation, only release, the same quiet permission he had offered before, now deepened by the light, by the understanding that had settled into both of them itself. Yet the mark remained, subtle but present, a place where something had been seen, where something had been held onto when it could have been lost. Inside, the warmth held steady, the fire now reduced to glowing embers, its work done, its presence still felt without needing to burn brightly. Oliver remained there, not moving away, not stepping forward, simply present, his hand resting lightly against Rex, his attention grounded in the steady rhythm that no longer felt fragile, but certain. And in that quiet continuation, in the gentle unfolding of morning, there was no need to revisit what had happened, no need to explain it or give it shape beyond what it already held. It was enough that it had been done, enough that it had been seen, enough that something had stayed, when leaving would have been easier. By late morning, the light had settled into something steady and honest, no longer fragile or uncertain, but clear enough to show everything as it was. And in that clarity the house carried a quiet rhythm again, not the same as before the night, but something deeper, something shaped by what had passed through it. Oliver moved slowly between rooms, not with urgency, but with a deliberate calm, as though each step acknowledged that the world had shifted slightly, even if nothing outwardly demanded attention. Rex remained by the hearth, though now he was no longer entirely still, small movements returning to him in quiet increments, a shift of weight, A slight adjustment of his legs, the careful lift of his head that lasted a moment longer each time before resting again. Immediate interest, only making it available, the same way he had placed the bowl earlier, without pressure, without demand. "When you are ready," he murmured again, the phrase now carrying a quiet repetition, a rhythm of patience rather than urgency. Outside, the frost had nearly disappeared, leaving the garden damp and dark beneath the pale sunlight, the disturbed earth now more pronounced in its contrast, a place that did not blend back into its surroundings, a mark that remained even as everything else returned to its ordinary state. Oliver found himself glancing at it often, not out of fixation, but recognition, as though it had become part of the house's memory, something that could not simply be undone by daylight. The telephone rang once, its sound clear but not jarring, and Oliver crossed to it without hesitation, lifting the receiver with a steady hand. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, carrying the reassurance that the child had arrived safely, that their condition had improved, that warmth and care had done what time alone might not have allowed. Oliver listened quietly, asking only a few simple questions, his tone even, his words few, absorbing what mattered and leaving the rest unsaid. When he set the receiver down, the house felt different again, not changed, but affirmed, as though something that had been held in uncertainty had now been placed on steady ground. He returned to the sitting room, his gaze finding Rex immediately, drawn back to the quiet center of everything that had unfolded. "They are going to be all right," he said softly, the words carrying a quiet certainty now, no longer tentative, no longer cautious. Rex's head lifted a little more this time, the movement slow but intentional, his eyes opening fully for a brief moment, meeting Oliver's gaze with a clarity that had not been there before. There was no strain in it, no confusion, only presence, grounded and aware. Oliver allowed himself a small breath of relief, not outward, not dramatic, but real. "You hear that," he added quietly. "You did not stay for nothing." Rex's gaze lingered for a moment longer, then shifted slightly toward the bowl of water nearby, his attention settling there in a way that suggested something simple yet significant. Oliver did not move immediately, did not rush to assist. He simply watched, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Slowly, carefully, Rex shifted his front legs beneath him, the movement measured, controlled, his strength returning in small, deliberate steps. Response, not demanding acknowledgement, simply existing as truth. Rex did not answer, not in any way that could be measured, but the steady rise and fall of his breathing remained, the quiet continuation of something that had chosen to stay. Frost gone, leaving behind only the marks that mattered, the subtle indentation where everything had converged, where a choice had been made without words. Oliver stepped out once more, not because he needed to, but because something in him felt drawn there, as though the place itself held a quiet gravity that could not be ignored. He stood over it, hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze steady, not searching for answers anymore, but simply recognizing what had been left behind. "It does not look like much now," he murmured, almost to the air itself. "Just a patch of ground." But he knew better. He remained there for a moment longer, the breeze moving lightly through the hedges, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and early spring beneath the lingering chill, a subtle reminder that even the coldest nights gave way eventually, that what seemed fixed and unyielding could soften, could change. When he returned inside, the warmth greeted him again, no longer a contrast, but a continuation, and Rex had moved once more, this time pushing himself up onto his front legs, his body trembling slightly with the effort, yet holding steady, his head lifted fully now, his eyes clear, focused. Oliver paused in the doorway, not interrupting, not stepping forward immediately, allowing the moment to unfold on its own. Rex glanced toward him, the connection immediate, familiar, and in that look there was no trace of the night's strain, only recognition, only presence. "There you are," Oliver said quietly, a faint warmth touching his voice again. Rex shifted his weight slightly, testing it, adjusting, and though he did not stand fully, the intention was there, the strength returning in quiet increments. Oliver stepped closer then, his movement slow, his hand extending not to lift or guide, but simply to be there, to offer support if it was needed. Rex leaned into it just slightly, not from weakness, but from familiarity, from trust, and then steadied himself again. You always did things your own way, Oliver murmured, a soft note of something almost like humor beneath the words, though it did not disturb the calm that filled the room. The hours moved on, unremarkable in their passing, yet full in a way that did not require attention, marked by small movements, by quiet recovery, by the steady continuation of breath and presence. Later, as the light began to fade once more, not into darkness, but into that gentle dimness that comes before evening, Oliver sat by the window, his gaze resting somewhere beyond the garden, beyond the hedges, not focused on anything in particular, yet aware of everything at once. Rex lay nearby, no longer in the same place, no longer bound to the hearth, but settled comfortably, his breathing even, his body at rest in a way that spoke of recovery rather than exhaustion. The house held them both in that quiet space, neither demanding, neither needing more than what was already there. They will grow up, Oliver said softly, the words emerging without prompting, carried by a thought that had lingered quietly since the morning. They will not remember this night. Not the way we do. He paused, his gaze lowering slightly, thoughtful. But that does not mean it did not matter. Rex's ear flicked once at the sound, a small, instinctive response, and Oliver allowed himself a slow breath, the weight of the past hours settling fully into something he could carry without strain. Some things are not meant to be remembered, he continued quietly. Only lived. The room remained still, the fire now only a faint glow, the last of its warmth blending with the lingering heat of the day, the quiet sounds of the outside world filtering in softly through the glass. Oliver did not move for a while, not because he could not, but because there was no need to. Everything that had required action had already passed. Everything that remained was simply presence. Eventually, as the light dimmed further, he stood, moving to adjust the blanket near Rex, his hand resting briefly against the dog's side once more, feeling that steady rhythm that had guided him through the night, that had not faltered when it mattered most. You stayed, he said softly, the words simple, unadorned. That was enough. Rex did not respond in any visible way, but he did not need to. The truth of it was already there, already settled into the quiet spaces of the house, into the earth outside, into the steady